Our next speaker up is Chris Keegan, one of the bridge specialists with NCPP, and he's going to talk about 10 years of progress in preservation in Washington State. So welcome for Chris.
I decided to do this report over 2.5 years ago. And at the time, when the partnerships first began, John over here had one of his first jobs is that before we had any of these partnerships, before we had any of the meetings, we had a series of questions that were sent to all the states. And majority of states actually answered them. And each of the partnerships had decided what questions they felt were important to ask. And for the Western states, because I was the chair at the time, I took the first question that a lot of them were asking, and that is, do you have a definition of bridge preservation? And I took that out, because I knew, as Becky said, that the T9 was working on a definition of bridge preservation. And I actually sat through one of their meetings, and it was a real fight as to what the definition of bridge preservation was. And I thought that was pretty silly. Just come up with a definition and send it out to everybody, and we'll go with it, and then we'll Xerox it and change it as time goes on. But that's not what they came up with. They actually hammered it out and came out with a definition, which is actually, if you look in the bridge preservation guide that Federal Highways put out, it's right there in the front, and it hasn't changed now in 10 years. And the very first one that was in the Western Bridge is, what are your bridge preservation activities? And I answered for the state of Washington back then. And here is what I put down. Bridge maintenance is deck patching. What we do in Washington, joint repairs, structural repairs, steel truss washing, movable bridge preventive maintenance and operations. We service navigation lights. We have a crew that paints the 2 Tacoma Narrows bridges. For bridge contract work, we paint, we rehab, replace, we do scour work, seismic, and major repairs. And that was back in 2010. Does anybody notice something about that as far as preservation goes? About what maintenance does? Majority of what we had at the time were really repairs, things you had to do to fix things. As far as everyday preservation work, we didn't do much. In fact, the truss washing was a pilot program, because at the time, 1974, we had the Clean Water Act, and they really came down hard on the states as far as cleaning your bridges. And what we did is, a number of years before this, we sat down with the Department of Ecology in Washington to try to hammer out what the problems were and why we couldn't get out and clean the bridges. And what they told us is, the Clean Water Act is a lawyer's dream. Anybody can sue anybody for polluting the waters of the state. And they said, not only are you, the DOT, going to be sued if you do something, if we're not there to make sure you're doing it right, they're going to sue us also. So we have to do our due diligence to make sure that you don't pollute the waters. So a little pilot program with 4 bridges eventually went to 17 bridges. And even though year after year we checked the condition of the water upstream and downstream, and we found little or no difference in the quality of the water, they kept saying there's not enough data, so we kept adding bridges to the group. So we finally came up with 17. And by doing that, we were able to come up with a program. But what we didn't have money to actually do the program for bridge washing. But as Mike Hill says, never let a catastrophe go to waste. And he was talking about his bridge across the Mississippi between Arkansas and Tennessee that was all in the papers not too long ago. Well, we had our very own. That was Skagit River Bridge. Remember the overheight load that took the span down? It was a steel truss. And what was noticed in the papers, is when they cleaned the bridge, that everything under the dirt was being corroded away. They said, why haven't you been cleaning your bridges? Well, it was very obvious. It was because the Clean Water Act wouldn't allow us to. But we had a permit by then to do the work, but we didn't have the money. Well, that year, the legislature had given us $10 million to do permanent pavement markings. And then we had shown to the legislature that we could save a lot of money if instead of painting stripes every year, we used the methyl methacrylate and put that down, and we could go about 5 years before we had to be out on the road again. So they asked me, they said, how much money do you need to do a bridge washing program? And I said, well, how much time do I have? He says, no, I want your answer now. So I said, for a biennium, $2 million. They gave me $2 million. What I'd forgotten to do, though, is to add in the cost of the equipment into that. And so we actually were able to get started. And I'd kind of planned that at the time that, because our pilot program had shown the first year, one bridge took us 2 weeks to clean. By the time we got to year 4, we could do 2 bridges in a day. So once you get them clean, they stayed pretty clean. And so we could really increase the amount of work we do. But to do that, we needed the under-bridge inspection trucks to get all of the nooks and crannies and corners, and we didn't have those. And if you know, those things are not cheap, about $650,000 plus to get those things. So that took a big chunk out of my $2 million. So we actually bought one, and then we were able to get money to buy. We took one of the used ones from our bridge inspectors, and we were able to put together another one. We had to send it in, get it rebuilt, and so on. So now we have 2 under-bridge instruction trucks for maintenance. So that was really a big coup for us. Poor coup for me, because I hadn't figured the cost of those things in. But the maintenance people told me, hey, we need these things or we can't do the work. The 4 that the inspectors had, they use those quite a bit, because they also do inspections for local agencies. And they're used quite a bit. And besides, they take a lot of maintenance. You've got to get them in the shop quite often for routine maintenance. Now, well, the preservation activities, that was then, preservation activities now. Something else that we came up is timber bridges. We have about, I think I told this story just a little while ago. When I started with the DOT back in 1978, we had 119 timber bridges. At that time, they told us within 10 years, we're going to get them all replaced. Well, you know how funding is. So today, we still have 90 timber bridges, and we still have to maintain those things. And we hadn't been maintaining them. We did replace parts now and then, but as far as preservation, we didn't do much work at all. Found out from industry, though, is that the use of borate. Well, for the first thing I did, we had a bridge that had carpenter ants. They're just totally infested. So what do you do when your house, when you have carpenter ants? You call in those pest services, right? Well, that's what I did on one of our bridges. And so we had a contract, and they'd go out there and take care of the bugs. And it worked pretty well. But what I found out is we could have maintenance folks do it. We're using borate, these borate rods. You drill that thing in every 6 to 8 inches, 3/4 inch rods, and you pluck those things in at the first sign of any rot. And with that, you can extend the life of that timber member. You got to find those. One warning about those things is that they're no good for in-water piles because they're water soluble, so they just kind of flushes out. So, but anywhere else, you can use those. In steel, before we used to use crack arrest holes. You drill the hole, and then 4 years later you drill another hole, and 4 years later you drill another hole, and you keep what they call chasing the crack. It was kind of a waste of time. But I was at the subcommittee on maintenance meeting when it was in Seattle, and there was a company there, Fatigue Technologies, Inc., and I started talking with this guy, and he says, what you need is our tool. And it says, use the same thing that the airline industry does. And this came from Boeing, because they were having problems with their airplanes, with cracks, fatigue cracks showing up in through the 60s. But they came out with this crack arrest tool, where you put in a bushing. For every time they put a rivet hole, they put a bushing in it and expand a mandrel through it. And that causes a zone of compression in the metal. And with that zone of compression, it mitigates the fatiguing of that metal. They said, And why not use this also on your bridges? You have problems with cracking of your steel due to fatigue. So we started to use it. We weren't the first ones, like New York. There were a number of other places that jumped in on the bandwagon first. But right now we've used it a couple hundred times, and we really haven't had a failure. We've had some of the bushings fall out, but as long as that zone of compression is still there in the metal, they said it's still good. Concrete ceiling. Wow, what we're doing now, and this has only been over the last 4 or 5 years, we started doing concrete ceiling. We try to focus on decks that are still in good condition, 7 or better. We've used just about everything. We've used silane, epoxies, methyl methacrylate, and we have a little pilot program now where we're trying Pore Shield and the Alchemco product, trying to find something that lasts longer than 3, 5, or 7 years, because it takes time to get out there on the road and do the work. On the joints, we're focusing now on keeping, if we put in a new seal, we try to come back annually and clean it out really good, make sure it lasts longer. And if it looks like we're having a problem, we reseal it. And we continue with movable operations. They all have a list of everything they do. They have a program that pops up, what they for daily work, weekly, monthly, year, annual, and so on. And steel bridges, what we've done, if you see the clamps on the one on the left, those are aluminum. One of the problems we used to have is how do you replace a cap over water? Because you can't build any and raise it up. So instead, one of our maintenance people came up with these aluminum clamps. They're fairly lightweight, clamps to the pile, and you can lift up the cap. And what we did is, instead of replace the cap, we had our bridge office came up with a design, and what they did is they just clad the cap. And the steel that we put in there is sufficient to take the load that the cap used to do. And so you only raise it up a little bit, you put that in place, you bolt or you weld it in place, and the bridge is good to go. And we have a couple bridges that every cap has been treated that way. Another one, we had an entire bent that was, we jacked up, put all new timber members in. What was there before was old growth timber. What we put in is new growth. And within 6 months, we had to replace those because they crushed. Because the newer timber just couldn't take the load that the old growth could. And so we replaced everything with steel, and that's been there now for about 15 years. We've also been replacing piles that are really too far gone to repair with steel, and we make a connection with concrete around the base. We've also replaced square members with square steel members, paint them black so it matches what's there. And we've also tried wrapping some piles with fiberglass wrap, pumped those things through with Borrate, and then we pumped in epoxy into the voided members also. The picture you show there, that's a bridge that's been replaced. So we took that out. We were going to test that pile, see how good it was, and we found out the epoxy never set up when we pulled the pile out. So we really couldn't test it. Here's with Borrate. Again, it's activated with 25% moisture content. Protection lasts about 10 years. Insert rods 6 to 8 inches apart. It's also a good idea to squirt Borrate liquid into the hole prior to inserting rods. And if you look to in this picture, the far right, we kind of stuck a cork in it at the end. But they also have these little plastic things you can stick in there and put a date on. That's when you put the Borrate rod in there. And the inspectors can also pull that thing and look inside and see what condition the Borrate rods are, if they're still active. For bridge cleaning, preservation actions with bridge cleaning is we hand clean first. We spot and area paint as needed. We include cleaning decks, drainage, and pier caps. Another thing that, if you don't know, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if you have a bird problem on your bridges with pigeons and starlings, you have to worry about those two things because they're not protected species. You call in USDA, they'll take care of them for you. We also like to encourage raptors, hawks, kind of keep the pigeons and starlings away. So we like to encourage them to stay. Another thing is to do your cleaning. It's best if you can plan those things to do them just before the inspection, because especially bridges with birds, we find that between the time we inspect it and they don't show up for 10, 11 months later, that they're too dirty to actually do a good inspection on. Cold expansion. Here is we actually have a plan set for doing the cold expansion use. Here's a picture of that. What you see up at the top, that hole, that's the crack arrest hole. And what you see, that tail on that thing is the crack that propagated within a year. When we put the bushing in, that's what you see down below. We used the mandrel in there, expanded that. That's been in there about 4 years now without the crack going beyond it. One difference between the crack arrest hole and putting the bushing in, the crack arrest hole, you find the end of the crack and you bore your hole there. The bushing, you want to leave 2 millimeters of steel in there. You don't want to drill it at the end of the crack. You want to at least have a little bit of steel left in there when you bore your hole and put in the bushing. Preservation actions that go to contract in Washington, paint steel bridges. One of the things that we have a backlog of $777 million in our painting work. It's really our plan to do steel trusses about every 20 years. We've actually had to extend that to at least 30. Steel girders and so on that are kind of protected by the deck. We think we can get 30 years, but we've had to extend those to about 40 years. These are kind of the general rules. The actual condition of the paint governs. In addition to the average traffic is factored in. Interstate bridges, border bridges, and major arterials are prioritized ahead of the rest when you do our work. There's not enough money to do everything, so you got to do what you can. And one of the things we did is we have our maintenance crews doing some touch-up painting. This is a two-part. We had the Termarust people come. Now the shiny stuff you see on the left is actually a fixer that fixes the rust in place, and then you overcoat it after that. It's two-part. It's really ideal for maintenance crews to go out. They can clean it, and you don't have to wait for that first coat to set up. You just paint right over the top. And this bridge is 507/114 Deschutes River. You see the steel there? That's kind of historic because those are part of the floor beams of Gallup and Gertie, the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge. When that thing failed, you see 1943. Steel was hard to get. We were making tanks with everything you could make of steel at that time. So you couldn't find much steel, but we had this leftover. They were taking apart the old Tacoma Narrows Bridge that had failed. And there were a lot of bridges built in that time from the parts that were left over as they tore them off the Gallup and Gertie. And these are some of it. Engineers put it together. They hooked the floor beams together, and this is continuous across. It's a 3-span continuous steel. There's 4 girders made up of the floor beams from the original Tacoma Narrows. The steel is still in pretty good shape, and it's got a 6-inch timber deck on top. Here's a deck seal. As of a year ago, we've done with maintenance, about 600,000 square feet of deck sealed. This is a picture of TouchUp River Bridge, 1251 South. So just kind of squeegee everything else. This was an epoxy. And rather than having buckets, which the first few we did with sand and spread it, they got a salt spreader on the back of a pickup truck to do. I think Minnesota and some other states have entire trucks that they have that do all this work for you. So they've gone a little farther than we have. We're still learning. Further questions? I skipped number 2. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm only answering about, says, how does your state identify, same as we did back in 2010? How are your bridge preservation activities funded and dedicated? I'll show you what that is. Then I'm going to talk about our performance goals. We've changed those. Examples of successful preservation strategies. I think I already covered that. How are bridge preservation needs prioritized versus rehab and replacement? State of Washington, we are funded just by our gas tax. And right now, the gas tax in Washington, one of the highest in the United States at 49.4 cents. And this has been very progressive. You get 9.5 cents to a nickel added, and the latest was 11.9 cents. And one of the things, my daughter worked for the Senate, and that 11.9 cents, in order to get that 11.9 cents, you got to get enough legislators to vote for it. In order for them to vote for it, they're going to ask for something. And it could be a new interchange, it could be as simple as a crosswalk somewhere. But they're going to want a piece of that so that they go back for their vote next year for the people to say, here's what I got for you, this is why I voted for the gas tax. And hopefully they'll understand. But in order to do that, guess what gets left in the end? Preservation and maintenance. Those are actually the last things funded. Everything else is, there's a project that covers everything else. And so what we ended up in Washington is you talk to the senators and the legislators, and they say, yeah, we've only funded preservation and maintenance to half of your needs. Our inventory is continually increasing. We got sued by the tribes in Washington that a lot of our culverts are fish passage barriers. So we were turning these little 4-foot diameter culverts to 400-foot bridges so we can make sure that fish can get through. Our bridge maintenance backlog over the last 10 years actually increased 400%. And over the next 10 years, what we expect is $1 billion needed for bridge decks, $711 million needed for bridge replacement or rehab, and $777 million needed for bridge painting. And this does not include major bridges. The Columbia River crossing is not in that amount. So we'd have to find, and that's another $1 billion right there, I think. There's hope for bridge washing. Again, we got funded $2 million per biennium. We got our bridge cleaning permits, still trust bridges. The washing program was praised and emulated. Federal highways said that Louisiana, Kentucky, Rhode Island, Columbus, Missouri, all these have used what we've done. Like I said, this networking, it's gone out beyond that. New funding strategies in preservation. What they did is they carved out $6 million from our preservation program to give to maintenance. Because we can do stuff in maintenance for about 1/4 of the cost of going to a contract. And these are fairly small. We can take care of this. If you figure what it takes to put a contract together, go out to add, and then you still have to have your people go out and inspect them and so on. If you give it to maintenance, it's theirs. They own it. If they screw up, they got to go back and fix it. And so we can do it for quite a bit less in maintenance. And so for things like deck seals and some of this other stuff, we can do it fairly inexpensive. Bigger projects, yeah, those need to go to contract. But what we were able to do with the $6 million is to form 2 new bridge crews, along with their equipment, their facility, and their tools. Besides the $6 million, we also got $1 million to get the equipment and, place for these people to reside. Also, the legislature gave, in connecting Washington, some maintenance funds, $2 million per biennium for all maintenance needs, but for some reason we haven't tapped that yet, because we got that and then this COVID thing hit. And so we actually sent everybody home for a while, and so we got further behind. Our performance goals. In 2010, our performance goals were bridges in poor condition. We wanted that less than 10% by number of bridges. Now, we flipped that. Bridges in fair or better at 90% by deck area. We used to count by bridges, now it's by deck area. And we didn't look at poor now we look for fair and better. So we have backlog reports and paint overlays, replacement rehabs. That's continued. Maintenance, continuous percent of priority 1 repairs that we get from our inspectors. Percent of steel trusses cleaned. We have like 126 steel trusses. We try to clean them annually. Decks, what we do is each of our regions come up with how much they think they can get done in the biennium, and that's what we compare. We're nowhere near getting to everything we need to do. So if we looked at just the bridges that we ought to do, we wouldn't show a very good report. But we put what we intend to do, at least it looks a little bit better. Along with joints, lineal feet, we report how much we think we can do over the biennium and then see how close we can get to that. How are bridge preservation needs prioritized versus rehab replacement? Our funding comes from the legislature, and I think I already covered that things get around, and also they had to carve out the money for fish passage barriers because the court said we had to do all those. The next couple of questions is how do you capture work accomplishments, and approximately what % of your bridges or maintenance is corrective versus cyclic? So how do you capture work accomplishments? Contract preservation, painting, deck overlays, said it was an increase or decrease in our backlog. Repairs that come from the repair list generated from bridge inspections. These are prioritized 1 to 4. 1 we're supposed to do within a year, down to 4, which is just keep your eyes on it. And so it's a % of priority 1 repairs completed within a year of notification. As I pointed out, that backlog of those repairs has increased over the last 10 years. % of trusses cleaned. Up until the pandemic here, we were getting those 126 cleaned. And then the square feet of deck sealed, again, these are covered, and the joints, we just decide what we think we can do with the funding that we have and see how close we can get to that. And approximately what % of your bridge as maintenance is corrective versus cyclic? Since 2010, I think, trying to guess what we did, we were like firemen back in 2010 because we had a bridge hit with pothole. We were running from bridge to bridge. You know, people would call up and the bridge crew would change whatever they're doing that day to go take care of what was wrong today. And so we really didn't have a plan. We just reacted to the circumstances that occurred. But now I think we're up to about 25% because we do address bridge cleaning. We're doing more. We're carving out the money. We're given the money for preservation, the cyclic type. So we try to get our deck seals. I put a big emphasis on replacing joints. I think that's the number one thing, if you're going to prioritize anything. Because we started using salt, whereas 15 years ago we didn't salt in Washington. We put down grit, but we didn't salt, but now we do. So it's important we get that salty water stopped at the deck level and get it washed out. So now we put a big emphasis, and I looked at our interstates, our multiple lane, and I started going down, you know, from Oregon up. There wasn't a bridge that I found where we didn't have leaky joints. So we could just start from one border and go to the next and just have projects of replacing joints. That was kind of the condition of our joints, you know, unless it's a brand new bridge. I could expect that the bridge's joints would need replacement. Lessons learned, collect and use data. That's what you use to sell your program to the legislature. As I said, never let a bridge disaster go to waste. Usually it's good for some money. I think what they said is you got about 6 months. That's about as long as the public remembers things. So you better jump on it right away. Work with the other agencies. You know, don't say they're the enemy. Figure out what their needs are, what your needs are, and come up with a solution. Use the media to tell your story. Get out there and tell them every time we have a bridge hit, you know, be out there. You know, call up the TV and radio stations. Get them out there. Show them the problems you have. Those people have to drive over those bridges. They don't want them to be falling down, so tell your story. Use funds from any resource you can get. Like I said, I stole a lot from other programs to get more into the bridge program. Be persistent. Don't give up. Realize you cannot save them all, but preserve all you can. Carve out funds for preservation. They will never prioritize to be done. The pothole in the deck prioritizes every day. Those are the ones you get the complaints about. Be involved in the bridge preservation partnerships. You learn an awful lot. You can get much more efficient as you get stuff done. You're not out there every 4 years putting in a new crack or rest hole if you use the bushing method. You get it done, it's done once, you don't have to go back. I'm done, so questions?
Any questions for Chris?
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.